Thank you very much. I also must begin with an apology. Number one, we're running late. Number two, my son Kevin, my grandson is having a birthday party shortly, so I'm going to keep this even shorter than I had anticipated. And to apologize, I have no slides, and frankly, I don't have much good information in terms of what the state of the economy is in the United States. As I was sitting next to Dr. Achman, I looked at his sheet that said fiscal policy. And I thought, what has happened to the fiscal policy of the United States? It's quite embarrassing, frankly, because we've lost our way. We came from a surplus a few years ago, engaged in 2 wars that cost about $1.5 trillion and counting. We passed a tax cut, which added quite a few billions to our deficit, and we passed a drug prescription law, all of which were unpaid for. And so now we find ourselves in a very difficult fiscal situation. And for those of you who have been watching our political system play itself out on television, you have got to be somewhat discouraged in terms of where this is all leading us. And I wanted to touch upon this just briefly because we've talked about the stability of the Saudi economy, and it is. And you've heard all of the good news. It is enough to make a grown politician weep to hear a 7.1 growth rate, or to hear that the oil industry is growing 14% increase. That's good news for Saudi Arabia, not so good for those who are living in Atlanta or Washington or Maine. And so we can look to Saudi Arabia in terms of its stability, and it is one of the most stable economies that one could invest in this day. It has the rule of law. It is open to business. As you've heard from many speakers today, it's been rated as the 12th easiest place to do business with by the World Bank. And so it has open arms. It's welcoming investment into its economy. The stability in terms of the banking procedures that have been followed, they have not engaged in lots of CDOs or credit default swaps, not even from Citi. But their situation is such that it is very stable on the surface, to be sure, but it is living in a neighborhood which is not stable. And this really comes back to something that I have devoted much of my life to, and that is understanding the security of the region and its importance to world stability. Because if anything becomes unstable in that region, we know what happens. We like to say that capital is a coward, right? The moment there's instability, it takes flight. Right now it's flying in, but it could go the other way depending upon what happens in terms of the region itself. There are some internal threats to the security or stability. They are pretty well known in terms of what is taking place inside Saudi Arabia. We know that there is a definite attempt to diversify. By the way, when you talk about diversification, we have heard this before about how Saudi Arabia is going to move away from simply being an oil producer, being the gas pump of the world. Into other types of activities, information technology, agriculture, healthcare, which is in desperate need. But this time it's different. This time I think they really mean it. Before you could say, well, they were talking about it, but now, by virtue of the leadership shown by King Abdullah, they're really moving in that direction. And it's really, it's gratifying to see how they are, in fact, talking about moving a bit off from oil and more to gas exploration, and in terms of going to infrastructure, education, and the amount of money being spent on education is really quite, again, satisfying to all. The internal threats, Shia in the eastern province, youth unemployment, lack of skills within the young community, and the militant groups on the border of Yemen. Those are all the kind of internal threats that the kingdom is coping with and will have to cope with in the future. There are the external threats, have just talked about in terms of the Arab Spring, Syria, the unrest in Syria, Iran, in terms of Iran's activities to try to dominate the region. and the most recent allegation, at the moment an allegation, about an attempt to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States. One has to question the, quote, cost-benefit analysis of such activity, but perhaps more on that in a moment. The failure, as was mentioned earlier this morning, in terms of the failure of the Middle East peace process. It is stalled. It doesn't seem to be moving anywhere at this point, and a lack of movement on the peace process obviously translates into more potential instability. In terms of the Shia in Bahrain, that continues to be a source of some question. That's bound to raise some more issues with the United States Congress, which in turn is tempted to pass more restrictions in terms of our support for Bahrain, where we have enormous security interests. And then, of course, I mentioned the question of stability on the Yemen border. All of this brings me back to the United States to try to decide who we are in this new century. What is our role? Because our role is going to be critical. If you watch our political process, it's been said it's much like watching sausage being made. Not very edifying, to say the least. But you're seeing the debate play out by virtue of our lack of fiscal policy, that we are now, at least on the extremes, on the right wing and the left wing, trying to turn inward. You hear voices from very conservative Republicans saying, time to disengage. And you hear voices on the left, on the Democratic side, saying, time to disengage. Come home, America, which sounds very much like 1972, in which George McGovern was talking about come home, America from Vietnam at that time. And there's a temptation to say that we have to engage in nation building at home and let the rest of the world take care of the rest of the world. And that, to me, is a very dangerous period for us to pass through in terms of where are the voices for supporting strong engagement policy. Now, it's been frequently said that business follows the flag. In other words, business will go wherever the flag is planted, saying this is a stable area. But I think the opposite is actually true. The flag is actually following business, because it is the business community which is investing in places like Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Bahrain before, and into Qatar. All of these, business has been in the forefront. And it is the business community which really is the advocate for an engagement policy, and we have to keep remembering this. Yes, security is important to business, but security, business is very much dependent upon having a stable environment, but having that stable environment depends upon the business community. You are the advocates for making sure that the United States doesn't turn inward, that doesn't come back home, that lets Saudi Arabia take care of itself and the region, because our presence is critical. It's critical in the Gulf region, it's critical in the Asia-Pacific region, and it's critical throughout much of the globe. And it's something that the United States has to remind itself that we are still a force for stability and good, and out of that stability comes prosperity. And where there is instability, what you have is a lack of investment and a lack of opportunity, and then the world starts to become a very dangerous and chaotic place. So what is taking place in Saudi Arabia is very good. All of the advice you have heard is positive. It's a place that welcomes investment and business, and that's good for generating a more stable, not only region, but a more stable world. What we have to be concerned about is how we strengthen our security arrangement. This is as good as it's been getting, really, between the United States and Saudi Arabia. We talked about earlier this morning, there have been some difficulties to get over. In terms of 9/11, I think we're past that point. There are other issues in terms of what is taking place with the Arab Spring and how the United States has conducted its foreign policy. But what has come really to the forefront is the realization that the United States and Saudi Arabia must remain firmly engaged and a partnership that cannot be shaken. If that is in any way disturbed, then I think you have the seeds of not only discontent being sown, but you also have the seeds for instability, which will affect all of us. So my thanks are to the U.S. Saudi Arabia Business Council, to all of you who have come from the kingdom and elsewhere to be here today, and to engage in Mutual discussions, a lot was talked about this morning with respect and understanding. And there's another rule that we always have to keep in mind, that something was said by a former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. He said that all politics is local. And we have to remember that when we talk about engaging with Saudi Arabia or any other country, we have to appreciate what your politics are, the kind of challenges that you face in your region, and your culture, and your customs, before we make judgments on how we should proceed. And that's something that we don't always do. And when we fail to do that, then it causes the kind of disruption that can be disadvantageous to all of our countries. So thank you very much. I look forward, if you have questions, would love to respond. But you've got the experts in terms of the financial side and the fiscal side of things. I was here basically to just say a few words about the security, which is so critical. Without that, none of the other activities can take place. Thank you.